Hello, my name is Chris Parham, and this is my project for final reviews for the Dynamic Media Institute at MassArt Design Studio 2. And my two projects for my final reviews are Human Data and Data Human. Human Data will be dealing with, this specific project will be dealing with an app that I've designed. And the app deals with, for instance, human data and data human. And my human data project deals with what happens to your data when you join a social justice protest when it comes to employment, your credit, housing, military service, college admissions, and how it affects first-time protesters. And we're going to talk about that first, in which I basically have created an app that talks about um, how your data is used when you go to a social justice protest and how your data is used against you in most cases. And what I'd like to do is talk about, for instance, I chose four subject matters, four actual protesters who are going to be talking, I will be discussing. But first, we're going to look at my first concept for my original idea, which was mydatamyconstitution.com. And again, this deals with how data is taken, for instance, by the authorities and how misdemeanors are turned into felonies, for instance, especially after the George Floyd protests from 2020, of which my four subjects are a part of. So for instance, in this case, what I'm going to be doing is talking about how these four young people were arrested at Black Lives Matter protests during George Floyd in the summer of 2020, and how, for instance, the young lady on your right, her name is Maxima Guerrero. She was a DACA recipient, and she was originally put into ICE detention until there was an outcry about her, about basically how the Black Lives Matter protesters were targeted. And to your left, you're looking at Tiana Arata, who was also arrested at a Black Lives Matter protest around the same time that George Floyd was killed. And she was a 20-year-old college student. And the thing was, she was given 13 misdemeanors, which were kind of turned into felonies. And she was looking at some serious time in jail until they worked out a deal for her as well. And this is my purpose, my point about talking about what happens to your data when you get arrested at a social justice protest. And the same thing with my other two subjects, D'Angelo Sadine and also Lee Percy Christian, who, for instance, as an example, he he had to give up his First Amendment rights to protest because they originally gave him a $100,000 bail. And his lawyers had to bring it down because it was too high and he couldn't afford it. So they said to him that you can no longer protest. So you're basically giving up your Third Amendment rights. And the same thing with the gentleman to your left, where he was a job was lost. They caught him with bear spray and a taser for protection, which is legal in Indiana as far as open carry goes. But he was arrested, and he was up to facing a $5,000 fine plus at least a year in jail if he was caught, if they wanted to prosecute him. And these are my final designs for what I've got my data, my rights, in which, for instance, this is what the website would look like. And to your right, you're looking at what you would do is if you filed a complaint, you'd be able to put in your name and you would get assigned a pro bono lawyer to help you, especially with your data. And that's the purpose of this project, is talking about what happens to your data when you get arrested. And even if you don't have get charges, it's still there being used as background checks. And this is, for instance, this is what the website, the app, would look like. So we've got, as far as subjects goes, categories, HB1 visa, the right to protest, and protesting while Muslim. So it's pretty, it's one of those things where they basically have this information on you. And what my app does is protects your data and protects you as a United States citizen under the Constitution, in which you have a right to protest. And this is my Data Human project, which deals with jazz music. And it's saying basically, does mental health and improvisation equate jazz genius and jazz music? And this deals specifically with a study that was done by the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2018 that talked about different jazz musicians and their mental health issues. So, for instance, Charlie Parker dealt with depression. Nina Simone was diagnosed with bipolar. Miles Davis had psychiatric issues concerning substance abuse. John Coltrane and Art Pepper were both OCD. They really aimed for perfection. Thelonious Monk had issues as well. So this is my first title, Jazz as Data, Algorithm as Jazz. Does mental health equate genius in jazz music? And I basically based this project on that study that talked about how, for instance, jazz musicians, a lot of them deal with schizophrenia, for instance, like Bud Powell was schizophrenic and he was hospitalized as well. So this is my other one called Giant Steps as an Algorithm. And I've done at least 3 to 4 titles, basically. This one, just jazz as data. And as you can see here, this is a diagnosis of, for instance, Miles Davis, Paul Desmond, Bill Evans, Gil Evans, and other jazz musicians. And the bulk of the diagnoses, as you can see, were dealing with major depression. Um, and also, too, this is my fourth title, Data as Jazz and Improvisation. And by basically tying in the two and talking about how jazz music and how improvisation, which is music that a jazz musician comes off the top of his or her head, and what goes through the thinking of that jazz musician. What is going through the jazz musician's head when he or she is putting together pieces of work? How do they come up with this genius? What's going on inside their minds? And that's what um, this thing has done. This research study talks about how jazz musicians basically um, it's one of those things to where it has a lot to do with family history as well. So, for instance, if a musician has a history of depression, if a parent has a history of depression or suicidal thoughts, alcoholism, drug use, and so on. So there's the background part of it that's really, really important in terms of talking about how jazz musicians did the work that they did. So, for instance, this particular one talks about anxiety disorders, and also other aims, methods, and results of that specific study that talked about how jazz musicians did the work that they did. So also, I'm going to be talking about how through this project, I basically was really interested in what made the jazz musicians come up with the work that they did, but also how their backgrounds and also them dealing with segregation at the time and racism. Like Billie Holiday had so many issues going on when she did Strange Fruit and after she did Strange Fruit that it really shaped her career. But it was like one of the first real protest songs, basically recorded in the 1940s, so excuse me, 1930s and 40s, I believe. But she in itself was going through a lot of stuff, along with her and a lot of other female jazz musicians who were dealing with segregation and down south and what she saw down south, and that was the basis for the song Strange Fruit. So that is my project, and again, this is Data as Human, so I have at least 5 different titles for this project, and I also have films that I would like my reviews to look at as well. And what I have here, my final project is my thesis, From Reconstruction to COVID-19, You Are on Your Own Again, and how the medical profession makes Black people sick through healthcare inequality that dates back to slavery. So this project deals with, I've taken 5 different things going on, or excuse me, not 5 different things. This is my abstract, which deals with healthcare inequalities for former slaves and their descendants from the time of Reconstruction to COVID-19, and how the medical profession has been tied into slavery since before Reconstruction, and how Blacks have been discriminated against in treatment, medical outcomes, lack of urgent care compared to whites, and vaccine issues associated with COVID-19. So as an example, this picture that you're looking at right now is basically a medical diary, medical book basically on slaves. So for instance, my subject matters, as you can see to your left, would be Reconstruction, medical experiments, homemade remedies, 1918 influenza epidemic, Tuskegee experiments, Henrietta Lacks, AIDS crisis, Hurricane Katrina, Obamacare, COVID-19, and my conclusion. So again, this project deals with how the medical industry, for instance, as an example, when we look at a page like this, unethical experiments on Black women, and how, for instance, enslaved Black women were subject to cruel and unethical experiments by doctors such as J. Marion Sims, known as the father of modern gynecology, in which he performed more than 30 painful experiments, on a slave named Sally and others as seen below. So this project has a lot to do, again, with the whole idea of me using these separate categories to talk about how from COVID-19 and the inequality in terms of people not being able to get the vaccine, in terms of Black people, for instance, just like going back to the 1918 influenza epidemic. So again, this is my final project, and this is for my final reviews for 2022. And thank you very much.